I'm Dr. Jayne Bock. I am the technical director at the Wheat Marketing Center here in Portland, Oregon.
And what is your background in gluten and wheat?
Well, I attended Kansas State University in the grain science department for a bachelor's degree. I stayed on for my master's in food science, and then I moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for my Ph.D., choosing to focus on gluten structure function for my Ph.D. thesis. Afterwards, I moved to the University of Guelph up in Guelph, Ontario, in Canada, and did my postdoc there, again focusing on gluten structure function, especially in whole wheat breads. And after that, spent a few years in academia and moved into industry after that before I joined my current organization, Wheat Marketing Center.
Well, I'm super excited to talk to you today, and we've already talked before. So first off, thank you for lending your expertise and time. When talking about this, I'm going to assume that whoever's watching has done some of the reading that we have, so they're like somewhat familiar with the Gluten Network. And I wanted to hone in on one thing though in particular, which I feel like to me seems like a unique property of gluten, which is its ability to act like a rubber band. Like I feel like this idea of a network or a gel, we see that across a lot of different foods, but this idea of extensibility and elasticity seems unique. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Of course. So the viscoelasticity, as we call it, of the gluten network is very unique among food proteins. And so what I mean by viscoelasticity is that the gluten network has a component of viscosity that allows us to stretch it out. It also has this component of elasticity wherein after we've stretched it out, it's going to regain its initial positioning. Not 100% because it will have flowed in that stretching, but it will retract back on itself. And that's very unique in terms of known food structures and protein structures.
And when you're mentioning this viscosity, when I think of maybe viscosity, when we talk about something really being really viscous, we're actually usually thinking of something that's like really thick and resisting flow. But here you're really talking about the ability to flow. Like it's a little different.
Right, it is. If you take a freshly mixed ball of dough and you set it on the countertop and you allow it to rest, it is eventually going to relax and you will see that ball of dough start to flatten and widen. And so that is a flow state, that is viscosity, it is flowing. There is a limit to it though as well, because you have that elastic component that's trying to hold it in place and preventing some of that flow from happening.
Are there ways in which you measure that?
Yes. And the ways in which we tend to measure that in the industry tend to be unique within various food science analytical techniques. We use empirical dough rheology, large-scale dough rheology, talking about unique instruments like the farinograph, the alveograph, the extensograph. And what these are essentially designed to do are quantify the strength or the elasticity of that gluten, that resistance to deformation, as well as the viscous component, that extensibility, that desire or that ability to flow or stretch given enough time and energy.
When thinking about the gluten network, we have gliadin and glutenin, and gliadin is primarily responsible for the dough's viscosity and that stretchiness. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the mechanism or how? Because when I look at some of the models, it doesn't fully click as to like why it's doing that.
When we isolate gliadins and glutenins and we look at their properties by themselves when mixed with water, if you have a pure water gliadin mixture, it will flow. You can pour it more or less like a thick liquid. When we add water to glutenins, we don't see that flow. We can take that glutenin once it's been mixed with water, and we can stretch it out, but like a rubber band, it's going to snap back on itself. So you can kind of see the two different components, the gliadins contributing the viscosity and the glutenins contributing the elasticity. When you combine them together, the way that the gliadin interacts with the glutenin proteins, those gliadins that are able to interact with that glutenin network, they're going to serve as chain terminators. They're going to kind of decrease the polymeric size of that network if they're interacting, or they're going to be interacting along the backbone, and kind of in a way that's going to delay that period of time that it takes for the glutenin to retract back on itself, and thereby providing viscosity in that way.
I feel like you see something along this line a lot when you Google gluten network. This is a very static image. So I was just wondering if you could try to explain like what's actually happening when we're stretching the dough, like while we're actively kneading or maybe like checking to see how stretchy it is. How would this change, or how would you describe it?
As you stretch this out, obviously you're extending that glutenin backbone. A lot of those gliadins are going to kind of end up sandwiching themselves in between those various glutenin chains. They're going to kind of get sandwiched in there. And once you stretch it out and you kind of remove that force that's holding it stretched out, the glutenin is going to want to snap back on itself. And because those gliadins are kind of wedged in there, sandwiched between the different chains of that backbone, it's going to take time for that glutenin to be able to kind of snap back on itself. And it will never truly go back to its unstretched form. There's always going to be some amount of loss in terms of that ability to regain its initial starting position, because that gliadin wedged itself in there via hydrophobic interactions, hydrogen bonds, things of that nature. One of the ways to think about this when you're mixing a dough, every time you fold it with your hands, every time you see a revolution on the mixer, there are aspects of the network that are changing dynamically in that moment. And so what's typically happening, if we go all the way back to the wheat kernel itself and it gets broken down for milling, all of the proteins are contained in protein bodies. And we've kind of broken those protein bodies open, but all of the protein is still coiled up on itself, and kind of keeping separate. As you add water and mechanical energy, you can start to create opportunities for those proteins to interact and start to come to basically unfold out of those protein bodies and start interacting. Now, it takes time for that to happen. You have to add mechanical energy with that water to start to unfold the protein as we tend to describe it. We're actually breaking down those protein bodies. And so we're going to see more elasticity up front because we need to dissociate the various components of the glutenin macropolymer, the GMP, and start to essentially break it down so that it forms a continuous network instead of being, kind of coiled up on itself and not really interacting to the fullest extent with other glutenins and gliadins and subunits. So we are trying to break down the elasticity to get it to this optimal state, this optimal balance of extensibility with some elasticity still remaining.
And so I have two questions coming off of that. First, when you say breaking down, do you mean unfolding or other things in addition to unfolding?
It's a little bit of both. So you have a relatively compact and, for lack of better words, coiled structure in that initial protein body. It's a space efficiency thing. And so you have to start to, for lack of better words, unfold it through exposure to water and then mechanical energy. There's also, if you want to think of it as a breakdown stage that has to happen because you have certain hydrophobic interactions that are taking place, certain hydrogen bonding events that are taking place, and you have to break some of those or find more favorable interactions for them that will help build the network, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Is there ever a natural instance where we would see gluten form?
There is no natural way for a gluten network to form outside of crushing the wheat kernel and then adding water and mechanical energy. The way the proteins are deposited in the protein bodies. So gluten, as an umbrella term for the storage proteins in wheat, are there to serve as a nitrogen sink, so that when the plant is ready to germinate, it can break down those proteins and start to create the root and shoot structures with that available protein. So without intervention from man, there's no way in a wheat kernel that a gluten network would ever be able to form. In terms of the research that I've primarily focused on, gluten structure function, it's really understanding the structure of these gluten proteins and how they contribute to final product quality. And the requirements for good gluten for different types of products are different. And so in bread, we're looking for certain structures to ensure that we get nice high loaf volumes, appropriate aeration and texture to it. With something like pasta, the structural requirements are different. We're trying to make sure those starch granules are firmly entrapped in the gluten matrix, so that when we cook them, all that starch is retained in the pasta. It doesn't leach out into the water, and thereby it confers, a much nicer bite to it. It's not soft and mushy. It's a little bit firmer, for example. So in terms of structure function, we're trying to figure out what are the structural features necessary to create, the best or optimal end product quality, and it can be very different depending on what you're trying to make. And based on that, you can feed that back into breeding programs and start to select different wheat varieties for different types of applications. There are other areas of research that are more centered around some nutritional considerations, most notably celiac disease, and attempting to breed wheat with lower levels of these, for lack of better words, celiac reactive polypeptide units, and seeing if we can still make the same products with those types of wheat where we've deliberately bred for lower levels of these specific polypeptide segments that tend to be detrimental for celiac individuals.
Do you think that's a promising venture? Do you think that'll take a long time?
I don't ever want to say never. What I've seen so far, the initial efforts have not been very successful, in my professional opinion, by specifically removing, some of these protein subfractions that tend to have more of these celiac reactive, amino acid segments. You do remove a substantial amount of that functionality that gluten provides and what allows it to create such unique products, especially aerated, bread type products, I should say leavened products. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we will get there someday. I don't know that it will ever be with wheat. Gluten-free might be the market for that. But there again, you have to understand what gluten structure is providing to that product, what the gluten network is providing to that product in terms of functionality, and then find a means of replicating that with whatever gluten replacement system that you're attempting to utilize.
Mm-hmm. How much of your work or research around this idea of studying the gluten structure and function is, for lack of a better word, macro level observations versus more kind of particulate level
So
analysis?
a lot of my work has been focused on the secondary structural level of protein structure. So we're talking FTIR spectroscopy. And so we're really kind of getting down to as close as possible to the individual gluten network chains, things like that, trying to understand how they're bonding with one another, and based on those bonding patterns, starting interpreting those in terms of the types of structures that would be present or prevalent if these are the bonding patterns that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So it does get down to a very small scale level. And then we're attempting to relate that back to macro level measurements, some of those empirical dough rheology measurements that we take, actual bake test results, attempting to link those really small scale, very fine interactions at the chain level all the way up to what we're actually seeing in, for example, a finished bread.
Well, thank you so much for your time, both today, through emails, chatting before. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise and time.
Of course. I mean, I've been an educator for years. Still am an educator here at Wheat Marketing Center. We do workshops for groups all the time. So this is something I enjoy and something that I'm passionate about, especially if we're talking about gluten chemistry.